Welcome everybody. We had a great protest out there against the movie Animal Farm, and that was fun. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have some presentations here, and then after that we're going to have an open mic so anyone can come up just like before. This is our second nautical banquet for the Center for Political Innovation. Our last one was after we blocked the No Kings Parade, and now this one's after our mini rally that was kind of a Victory Day rally to celebrate the victory over fascism and also call out this Hollywood movie about George Orwell. So the main presentation tonight is going to come from Noah, and actually it was Noah's idea to protest Animal Farm. It was back in January. Noah told me that they're making a new movie of Animal Farm and that we should protest it. Orwell and Animal Farm is something we're all kind of given in school as part of our anti-Russia, anti-China indoctrination. We're the Center for Political Innovation, always trying to awaken people and get people to think about anti-imperialism. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Noah. So here we go. There you go.
Good to see everyone here. Just once, I'd like to give a speech on more than 5 hours of sleep. That's okay. That's life of an activist. A very exciting life. I wouldn't trade it to be a normie. So, I mean, folks at home or people around, you know, you may be wondering, it's like, why protest Animal Farm? It seems pretty trivial. Seems like, okay, they made a dumb movie about animals, and yeah, it's sort of anti-communist, but you know, whatever, who cares, sort of thing. I mean, it's a cartoon, right? But I think it's really important what we did today, and that was countering a narrative that, you know, is given to us from a time that we're very young. And it's something that is not really talked about a lot. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but the ideological training that we receive in America is a little more subtle than elsewhere. In a lot of countries, you may receive your propaganda or your ideological training in a history class where they tell you overtly, okay, this is what we believe in X, Y, or Z country, this is our ideology. But in America, it's a little bit more insidious. It tends to not be in history class that we learn any of that. History class is more about proving that you are capable of rote memorization, proving that you're capable of following orders and being good on the assembly line. But the propaganda and the ideological training that we receive tends to be in English class. In English class in America, they walk you through English literature in a very discreetly ideological way, and they make you read books like To Kill a Mockingbird, which is extremely anti-populist and denies the right of black people to self-determination. And they make you read books like Lord of the Flies about how human beings are all evil monsters and there's no hope. And even the quote-unquote radical literature we believe, we don't read the works of John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, or East of Eden, or The Pearl. No, the radical thought that we're given is The Great Gatsby, which is about how the American dream is a lie and you should give up on your hopes and aspirations. And George Orwell it's another aspect of this ideological training that we're given, this training that human beings are fundamentally evil and wrong and that your enemies are your neighbors. But Orwell's a little bit smarter than other propagandists, especially for his time, way ahead of his time. Because at the time, you got to think this is the early 40s, 50s. Anti-communism at that time was kind of dumb. You know, it was here's a bunch of lies about communism. You know, anybody who is remotely liberal or thinks critically, or maybe they're anti-racist, or you know, their sexual orientation or whatever, they're a communist and they're bad, and anybody who's different from you is bad. Orwell's a little bit smarter than that, and he realized that you have to make propaganda for the kind of person who would become a communist, because what's more dangerous than the kind of person who would become a communist? Who is it more important to reach with your propaganda than the kind of person who may be inclined to disagree with you? And so Orwell is propaganda that's made to appeal to the kind of person who becomes a dissident, who's maybe they're a little non-conforming, maybe they're a little brighter than their peers, maybe they see things that other people don't, and they're the kind of person that bothers them. You know, they have trouble with dealing with bowing to social spontaneity. But to be honest, I'm exactly the kind of person that George Orwell is meant to appeal to. And I remember when I was a little kid, I was like, I must have been 10, 11, 12. I started getting in trouble in school, and they made me sit down with a psychologist. And I remember my mom was sitting there with the psychologist, and it's like, my son, I just don't know what's wrong with him. He's just so concerned about what's true. He's so concerned about what's fair and what's right and what's just. We keep trying to explain to him that kind of stuff doesn't really matter in America, that, you know, what matters is appealing to authority, but, you know, he just keeps being like, yeah, but it's wrong. And, you know, I was made to feel like I was a crazy person for feeling that. And so when I read 1984, I think I was like 12 or 13, I was like, oh my God, this is so deep. This is like exactly what my life has been like. When I'm like, look, you know, I was critical of Israel from a young age, and I would be like, hey, you know, look at the crimes that Israel commits against the Palestinian people. People would hand wave me, and I'd be like, but this is evidence. You know, like, look at all of the things that's right before your eyes. Who are you going to believe? So I was like, oh my God, 2 + 2 = 5, man, that's so deep. And what I didn't realize was that I was being groomed into the kind of person who would never change anything. Yep. You know, and that's Animal Farm 2. It's a little bit more direct in its criticism of communism. You know, 1984 likes to pretend like it's unideological, but Animal Farm it's also directly anti-communism. It's a direct attack on Stalin, but it too is also meant to appeal to dissidents. You'll notice in Animal Farm, it's not that the pigs are all inherently evil. It's that, well, some of the pigs, maybe they have good intentions, and there's this really good pig named Snowball who's supposed to be Trotsky, but it's that evil, that no good Napoleon, that no good Stalin who was empowering ordinary people to fight for their rights, who was industrializing the country, who was empowering the Soviet people and telling them to fight for their rights, who was making those dumb normies who, like, you know, follow rules or whatever, feel like they mattered. Well, he was the real problem, and that your problem is your neighbor. Some of you may not have read Animal Farm in school, so I'm just gonna go a little bit over the plot. So Animal Farm, it's supposed to be about the October Revolution, 1917, when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, and it tells the story of the Bolshevik Revolution, but instead of peasants and workers rising up to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy and end the First World War, it's a bunch of animals who are rising up to no longer be slaves to the farmers. And a central character, the character that is supposed to represent the Russian people in that book, is a character. It's Boxer the horse. And Boxer the horse is an idiot. Boxer the horse is not very bright. Boxer the horse follows Napoleon the pig, who is supposed to be Stalin around, and he tells him, you're always right. Napoleon is always right. And he's always going around to the other animals on the farm, making sure they follow the rules. And Boxer the horse, he injures his hoof defending the farm from invaders. And when Boxer the horse gets too old to work, the evil Stalin, the evil Napoleon, sends him off to die in a glue factory. And before I get into how disgusting of a portrayal that is of the Russian people and their sacrifice, I'm going to talk about what is it that makes Boxer the horse so effective. Because it's something that speaks to a truth that maybe you or I feel as somebody who is non-conforming. Boxer the horse is supposed to be a lightning rod for all of the anger that somebody who may potentially be a dissident would feel towards a conformist. You know, the kind of person who, it doesn't matter how much evidence you present them with, they just can't go along with disagreeing with an authority figure. I remember I was talking to a girl one time about China, right? And I just said offhand, well, you know, Taiwan's a part of China, because she kept saying like, oh, well, you know, China's going to invade Taiwan. China's going to invade Taiwan. I remember saying, well, Taiwan's a part of China. And she was like, no, everybody knows Taiwan's its own country. And I said, well, the United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as a country. And she's like, oh, no, that can't be true, because everybody knows Taiwan's its own country and China wants to invade. And I would say, look it up. In 1978, as a condition of normalizing relationships with China, Richard Nixon signed a deal that said that, you know, that recognized the one China policy, that recognized that Tibet and Taiwan were both parts of China. It just couldn't be true to her. She would say, no, everybody knows. I would say, just Google it. And this was a very high-achieving person. This was a person who had very prestigious internships, who went to a very nice college, but it just never occurred to them that something that they had been told by an authority figure could be wrong. And that's what Boxer the Horse is supposed to represent in the novel. It's not really an anger specifically aimed at the Russian people, although that's the effect that it has. It's supposed to be a lightning rod for your anger at nonconformists. But of course, the central claim about Boxer the Horse is a lie. And it's a really disgusting lie. And this portrayal of the Soviet people as a bunch of followers who didn't really know what's good for them, it's blatantly wrong. You know, these are the first people to break free from the Western financial system, to raise up their country from nothing. By 1927, just 3 years after Stalin had took power in the USSR, the USSR had tripled its pre-revolutionary electrification rates. That was nearly 3 billion kilowatts, only 1 billion kilowatts previously, most of which had been concentrated in the two major capital cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, previous to that. In 1914, nearly 60% of the population of Russia was illiterate. By the time the Bolsheviks took power, after the Bolsheviks took power, they had wiped out illiteracy. The Soviet Union was the country that defeated the Nazis. These are the people who defeated the Nazis. These are the people who conquered the heavens and invented space travel. These are the people who invented cellular phones and, guaranteed women the right to work. And moreover, the claim that it's making about the elderly is just like blatantly a lie. By 1949, the USSR had amended its constitution, guaranteeing all workers a pension at the age of 65 for men and 60 for women. And even during the World War II post-economic expansion in the United States, the average retirement age was 68. This is a far wealthier country. There would never have been a civil rights movement in the United States had it not been for Stalin and the Soviet Union, the sacrifices of the Soviet people. Because it was Stalin and it was the Soviet Union that brought the picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body and brought it before the press and showed the true horror of Jim Crow segregation and said, America is a country that is supposed to believe in freedom and democracy and rights for its citizens, and look how they treat people just because they look differently. And you never would have had Social Security in the United States had it not been for the fact that during the New Deal, there was a massive political party in the United States by the name of the Communist Party USA, which was backed primarily by the Soviet Union, was demanding some dignity for working people after their retirement, to capture the spirit of what the Soviet people felt and the real orgy of development that was going on at the time. There's a quote from Anna Louise Strong's book, I Change Worlds. And at the time, she's traveling around during the Stalin years and observing the industrialization. In Novosibirsk, I ran across Bill Shatov, building in a single year more railroads than the whole of Turk Siberia. He was sick. The nervous strain had affected his eyes. I asked why he didn't bring his wife out, have a home, comfortable routine, healthy living. Bill stared at me as if I had gone mad. He said, the greatest thing in life is to work. Not just to work, to create. In this particular bit of time in which we live, there is the chance to create without end or limit. Do you think I could turn aside from an hour of creation to be nice to a wife or to come home to dinner on time? Unforgettable words. They echoed over the naked steppe and re-echoed into the roar of railroads, steel mills. Out of nothingness, socialist cities. Out of chaos, a world in the making. No, not just work, creation. And that at the heart of the development that the USSR was undertaking was an empowerment of ordinary people to fight for their rights, to enable them to develop themselves and to achieve living standards that had not been seen in the world. And the USSR revolutionized film and art and literature and music and achieved things that no other country at the time had achieved. And for George Orwell to trivialize that sacrifice and to trivialize that achievement and act like it was just some moron who, it had never occurred to him to question authority is so profoundly wrong, it's offensive, and it's racist, and quite frankly, it's anti-human. Mm-hmm. But if you really study the life of George Orwell, you might begin to understand why it is that he might think that. So who was it that George Orwell was in actuality? The father of science fiction was a Russian American. His name was Isaac Asimov. And in the 60s, he wrote a review of 1984 that I find to be very insightful. And it talks a little bit about the life of George Orwell and what it was that motivated him. He said, quote, "George Orwell lacked the money to be an English gentleman to the full of his abilities. Then, too, he didn't want to spend his time at dull desk jobs. He wanted to be a writer. Thirdly, he felt guilty about his status in the upper class. So he did in the late 1920s what so many well-to-do young American people would do in the 60s. In short, he became what we might call a hippie at the time. He lived under slum conditions in London and in Paris and consorted with and identified with slum dwellers and vagrants, managed to ease his conscience and at the same time to gather material for his earlier books. But at the same time, Orwell himself realized the limits of his liberation. The proles, or proletariat, for whom Orwell cannot hide his British upper-class contempt, are left largely to themselves as subhuman. At one point in the book, he says that any prole that shows any kind of ability is killed, a leaf taken out of the Spartan treatment of their helots 2,500 years ago. And this is really, if you study the life of George Orwell, what he really was is he was a rich kid who sort of felt bad about his upper class status and went around the world trying to make everybody else feel bad for the fact that he had oppressed other people. His father was an administrator for the British Empire in India. He committed horrendous atrocities against the Indian people, kept them in a state of underdevelopment and poverty. And Orwell himself later grew up to be a colonial officer oppressing the people of Myanmar and making sure that they were poor. It's been pointed out by many people that 1984 was really George Orwell asking, what if the way that I treated people in Burma was happening to people here in Britain? And as George Orwell grew up, he became uncomfortable with all of the crimes that he had committed, and he decided that he was going to become a radical. And when the Spanish Republic was under attack by fascism, he decided that he was going to go to Spain and he was going to fight. But, the Stalinists who wanted to defend the Spanish Republic, they were a bunch of know-nothings. He can't work with those degenerate working people. Instead, they're not revolutionary enough. And so he decided to join the Trotskyites. And he fought with the POUM, the POUM in Spain, and committed atrocities, priests and nuns crucifying them, went around inciting peasants to try and overthrow the government. All the while, fascists were at the gates of the Spanish Republic. But it didn't matter to him because, the Spanish Republic wasn't radical enough. And, fascism would be a better alternative to giving up on, his middle-class privilege of feeling better than other people. It was later revealed, actually, Franco talked about how he had 4 columns outside of the city attacking Spain and 1 column inside of the city. It was later revealed that actually the POUM, the Trotskyites, they were being funded by the Nazis to attack the Spanish Republic.
Right, the 5th column.
The 5th column. That Orwell and the Trotskyites, they were the 5th column within Spain.
Yeah.
And Orwell spent his entire life LARPing as a revolutionary, but in reality, what he really was a cop. He was somebody who worked for the enemy. And he later went on to work for the Ministry of Information in Britain. He was literally a British propagandist. The Ministry of Truth in 1984 is literally based off of the job that he had in Britain at the Ministry of Information, where he decided what Brits could and couldn't see or think or feel. Moreover, we have this popular view of George Orwell as some sort of popular leader who, inspired people to fight for his rights, who was against totalitarianism. The reality of the situation was that George Orwell was a Fed who sold his comrades out to the cops. Yeah. He made lists of, I think, 134 people who he considered to be dissidents, and he gave them to the FBI and said, look out on these people. Yeah. Paul Robeson, phenomenal singer, phenomenal football player, who went on to be a communist and to be an anti-racist activist. He sent a letter to the FBI claiming that Paul Robeson was a dangerous Negro who was anti-white, and that he was working for the Russians because of statements like this. When Paul Robeson went to Russia and he came back and he was questioned before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, he said this.
When I was a singer years ago, and this you will have to listen to.
I am listening.
I am a bass singer, so for me, it was Chelyabin, the great Russian bass, not Caruso the tenor. I learned the Russian language to sing their songs. I wish you would listen now.
Mr. Chairman, I ask you to direct the witness to answer the question.
Just be fair with me.
I ask for order.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go
It
so
is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934...
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934...
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. Where I did not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. Jefferson could be sitting here, and Frederick Douglass could be sitting here. Eugene Debs could be sitting here.
Orwell, of course, read this statement and thought, man, this guy really, he hates white people. Like, what a dick. And he sent that straight to the FBI and, helped to sell out his comrades. Because at the heart of who George Orwell is George Orwell was a middle-class element who felt uncomfortable with his status. And it's the same problem that you see all over the left today. It's somebody who goes on to be a hippie. You know, they grew up, their parents were lawyers, or their parents were in the military, their parents were doctors, and they feel bad that they grew up rich, and they have a bleeding heart for people who they perceive to be victims, who they perceive to be oppressed, who they perceive to be lesser than them. But at the heart of their activism is the idea that ordinary people are their enemy, that their neighbors are lesser than them, and that only victims could ever be good. And I think that if anything positive is to come out of revolutionary work, it has to come out of a love for the people, not out of this middle-class resentment that George Orwell felt. And I think that that's exactly why we read his work in school, to receive the ideological training that we should become middle-class elements, to foster hatred for our neighbors, etc. Right. So, thanks.
All right. That was tremendous. That was a tremendous presentation. Thank you very much, Noah. And I want to congratulate Noah because Noah has just published, this is Juche for American Workers, which is a volume of the writings of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And Noah is going to be leading the Juche study group of America that is launching on Tuesday. We're having our first session, and they will be online, and they're open. Anyone can join. And I know Volume 2 is probably going to be in the works pretty soon. And every Tuesday night, you can get online and study Juche ideology with Noah, who will be leading the American Juche study group. So thank you for that, Noah. And thank you for putting forward the vision of having this meeting. So thank you. That was great. Now, I also want to acknowledge a couple other people. Now, Irving is always on top of me about having leaflets, right? Irving is very all about doing outreach and all of that. So I threw together a leaflet, and thanks to Irving, I was getting the leaflet together. But then I sent the leaflet to Jessica, right? And Jessica took a look at this leaflet, and she said, no, we can't do that. So in the interest of full disclosure, so the opening line of the leaflet is, Animal Farm is not a story about cute farm animals. Now, I had originally written Animal Farm is not a cute story about farm animals, but I thought that sounds a little bit repetitive. So I had changed it to Animal Farm is not a story about cute furry animals. And Jessica said, Caleb, you can't say cute furry animals. You can't do that. Can't do that, Caleb. That's not appropriate. And I thought, my goodness, my mind didn't go to dirty places, but there you go. She said, Caleb, you can't be handing out flyers about cute furry animals these days. That's R-rated. That's not appropriate. So good catch, Jessica, and thank you for rescuing our leaflet from the cute furry animals. And we love you, Jessica. We really do. We really do love you. And we really appreciate Briggy coming in. We really appreciate having you here. We really appreciate Eric. Eric brought a friend, and you're from the former USSR, right?
Kyrgyzstan.
Kyrgyzstan. So welcome, and good to have Eric here as always. Eric is a legend, speaking up, and so it's good to have your friend. What's your name again, by the way? Ayla. Okay. Very good. And Charles is a CPI member. He reached out to me, a fellow Brooklyn resident, and you've been doing CPI stuff, and that was great. And we ran into you. I think it was just random, right? I saw you on the street, but I know you going back to activism and yeah.
Randy Credico.
Absolutely. And we ran into you as well. You joined us from seeing us out on the street. There's my friend Michael, who we gave an award to last time. Michael was the Occupy Wall Street tour guide. So, and I guess. And Paul's in the bathroom, but we love Paul, so when he gets back, I'll give him a shout out as well. We really appreciate having everyone here. Those were great remarks by Noah. I just wanted to supplement them a little bit and talk about a couple things that are related. Then after that, we'll open up, and anyone can get up, open mic, and we'll just kind of enjoy ourselves. That's how we do things here. One thing I have become more and more annoyed by over the years is what you could call bad polemics. When someone's disagreeing with somebody, it's almost like paid work. It's like they're disagreeing simply because they're supposed to. And they go through and they find one sentence by the person they don't like and say, aha, and what they meant by this was that, and they're no good, right? It's cheap. And if you really want to do a good polemic, a really good polemic, is you dig into the person you're criticizing and you find out the essence of what they believe. And you really get to know it. You know, I tell people, if you don't agree with somebody politically, if you just ask what's wrong with them, that's too easy because you already know that because you don't agree with them. You should ask, what is the appeal? Why might somebody agree with this person? What is the appeal in their work? Why is it that somebody likes this other person? What are they speaking to? What attracts people? I don't like them, but why do others like them? And dig into their work. And that's what a really good polemic does. And so that brings us to George Orwell. And as Noah pointed out, George Orwell is, you could say it's anti-communism for the type of person that might be a communist. But what is the essence? What is it that people are getting from George Orwell's work? What appeals to them? And when I look at George Orwell's work, and I ask myself what appeals to people, I think it can all come down to a phrase, the allure of pessimism. Because pessimism is a very easy place to hide. Right? The ultimate pessimistic statement from George Orwell, he talks about, at one point in 1984, Winston is told, imagine the future, imagine a boot stomping on the human face. That is the ultimate expression of pessimism, if you think that's what the future is. But if you think that the world is going to hell, that gives you a place to hide. You don't have any responsibility, and you don't have any obligation. You can just kind of sit back and throw your arms up. There's no point, right? I think about, there's a country song from the 1970s. Why don't we all just get stoned?
Get drunk and sing beer drinking songs. Between brash them and begging, go lady and begging, we might as well all just get stoned. What about cleaning up our own backyard?
And it's all just like the world is going to hell and we're all just going to get stoned and get drunk, and it's a place to hide. And that I think about, some of the political arguments that we've had and people who've gone up against this. I've noticed that some people that fall into this pessimistic trap, there's two individuals that we've encountered over the years, both of them young white men. Their way of kind of being angry at people they disagree with is to claim, I grew up poorer than you. And I've always wondered, how is that an own? And everyone they disagree with, they say, well, you never worked a day in your life. And it's like, how is that, like what is that? But what they're saying is, well, I'm better because I've suffered, and maybe my life isn't good, but I'm good because I'm suffering. And that's the allure of pessimism. Winston in 1984 is good, and the world around him is bad, and he's got no chance of winning, and there's no hope, but he's the good one, and all the other people around him are the sheep. And that is a really tempting way to feel, especially if you're a dissident. And if you get into that mindset of, I'm Winston from 1984, and I'm the good one, and I'm surrounded by evil people, that gives you the ability to hide in this kind of place of pessimism where you don't have to accomplish anything and you can be bitter and hopeless. The Weather Underground, the terrorists, they used to compare the United States to Nazi Germany, and they were the good Germans. The Americans are just all like the Nazis, and we're the good Germans who protected Jews, and they got into that mindset, and that's what enabled them to carry out their terroristic bombings and and engage in their adventurous activities that didn't really benefit anything. I mean, they really isolated the radical movement, etc., but it was based on this contempt they had for the working class, for not just agreeing with them already, and it was a place that they could hide. And I remember, as Trump was coming into office, radical circles in America got very, very weird. I don't know if folks remember, but it was like, we were all told as soon as Trump takes office, we're all going to be rounded up, we're all going to be killed. And there was one leftist I had an argument with, and I think she's now an important person in the Communist Party. She wasn't in the Communist Party at that point. And I remember she was really angry with me because she asked me, what is your position on Brexit? And I said, well, I think a lot of people in Britain may be voting for Brexit for not good reasons, because they don't like immigrants or they don't like Muslims, but the European Union is a bad institution that violates the rights of working people, and to see Britain leave the European Union, maybe if people are motivated for bad reasons, is a good thing. Oh, she just couldn't stand that. How dare you? How dare you? And I said, well, no, I'm not going to support the European Union that violates workers' rights, the European Union that is as centralization of power of the big monopolies. We would like to see the European Union broken apart. She didn't want to hear that. And she said, Caleb, you have to understand when shit gets real, some people are going to be with us and some people are going to be against us. And I thought, okay, she thinks she's in a movie, right? She thinks she's in a movie. She thinks she's Winston in 1984. She thinks she's some people are going to be against us. And that's the danger of all of this. It gets people into this mindset of like, I'm the isolated good hero, right? And that's a dangerous mindset to get into. Another example of this, it's funny, the incel phenomenon. Right? What is inceldom, right? Well, the incel, the involuntary celibate, they've become kind of you could say the whipping boy of the internet, right? We just love to just attack incels, but they're a great example of these young men who they consider themselves to be unattractive or whatever, and so they've developed a worldview based on women will never be attracted to me and all of that. And it's the ultimate kind of defeated mindset, right? Of we can never get a girlfriend, we can never get anything, and that's proves that the world has a conspiracy, so we're going to build a community on the internet, all based on our kind of defeated, lonely feelings. That's that allure of pessimism. And I see the allure of pessimism. There's a big fight right now, or I guess big disagreement. The latest lefty drama, you could say, is between the Party for Socialism and Liberation and the Democrat Socialists of America. And the argument, it's an interesting debate that's happening, is the Party for Socialism and Liberation is a college phase. When you're 20 and you're in college, you first discover socialist politics and you join the PSL and you learn to make signs and march around in a circle around the greatest, latest trendy liberal cause. And after a year or two, you realize they have no plan to actually change anything. They're not really going to accomplish anything. And so then you grow up and you move on with your life and you kind of joke about, back when I used to be a socialist when I was in my 20s. And PSL runs these electoral campaigns. They have no chance of winning, but they're just kind of recruiting drives for the organization. And PSL is this revolving door activist club for 20-year-olds. And so Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, that the mayor of New York City is a member of, and that they have people like AOC and such, they have attacked the PSL. And they said, okay, well, PSL doing their pointless campaigns that are just recruiting drives, that's not what we need. They should all be voting for Mamdani. They should all be voting for AOC. That's where you can really accomplish something. And you can see that a lot of people are probably very convinced by DSA's arguments because they can see that PSL is a revolving door. And so they say, okay, well, if I vote for DSA, then it's not a revolving door. We can actually get something. Well, what do you get with DSA? Well, Chairman O'Malley of the African People's Socialist Party, he likes to talk about how DSA, they advocate Walmart socialism. Because at Walmart, they start you at $15 an hour. And socialism for DSA is $15 an hour. So it's Walmart socialism. But it's worse than that. It's people that support sending weapons to Nazis in Ukraine. It's people that support bombing and destroying Libya. It's the forces of the Democratic Party that are tied in with imperialism. And at the end of the day, we're not here to say that you should join PSL and march around in a circle. And we're not here to say vote for Walmart socialism that supports US imperialism. We're here to say there's actually an alternative. And we can see examples of that alternative around the world. One great example is the Union of Sahel States emerging. Ibrahim Traore is not giving people Walmart. He's using government funds to invest in the population and build and construct. And it's a pro-growth, anti-monopoly government investing in the community. And so you look at what Ibrahim Traore is doing, it is optimistic in the sense that it is investing in people and in the community. It's opposition to imperialism, but it's also not a kind of revolving door. And you look at that PSL versus DSA debate. PSL might be better on some questions, but DSA and PSL are really part of the same entity, which is the imperialist left, right? The left wing of imperialism. But, you know, the class question, and Noah touched on this very well in his speech. A lot of people, when they look at George Orwell, the phrase that is used kind of by dogmatic Marxists is they'll say, well, this is middle-class pessimism, or this is, are you ready for this, petty bourgeois fatalism. Petty bourgeois fatalism. It's a very highfalutin, you know, maybe somebody can write a Frankfurt School Review or something. But what they're saying is this, that as World War II came to an end, Nazi Germany battling against the Soviet Union and America, and they clashed, that coming out of World War II, the small business owners, when we talk about petty bourgeois, those are people that are capitalists in the sense they own their own business, but they're not part of the club. They're not part of the big monopolies that run the world. It's the small shopkeeper, it's the college professor, it's the lawyer with his own practice. The petty bourgeoisie came out of World War II, and they saw the Soviet Union rising, and they saw US imperialism rising, and they said, either way, we're screwed. If the Soviet Union wins, the working class government is going to nationalize our property and we're going to lose. And if America wins, the big monopolies are going to come in and they're going to subdue us and we're going to lose our private property. We're going to be shot down into the working class, so we're going to lose. It's that petty bourgeois fatalism, that there is no hope. And that's really, it's not just Animal Farm. You've got Anthem by Ayn Rand. Even before World War II, you had Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. That was 1938, that was published. But that's when they talk about petty bourgeois fatalism. That's what it was. It was the pessimism of the middle class. And what's interesting is the neocons, who were originally Trotskyites, right? They were part of the Socialist Workers' Party. When they broke with Trotsky and they had the fight in 1939, they were accused of petty bourgeois fatalism, of also seeing the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany as the same economic system, and that there was no future in either, and their entire mantra as they were breaking with the Socialist Workers' Party and ultimately breaking with Marxism entirely and eventually becoming neocons was we want our individuality, and our individuality is being taken away. We want to hold on to our middle-class property. It was an expression of petty bourgeois fatalism, and Trotsky himself criticized the Shachtmanites, they were called, for their petty bourgeois fatalism and called them that. But the thing is, in our time, that has a totally different connotation for a couple different reasons. But, well, I mean, first of all, we'll talk about with the fall of the Soviet Union. There were a lot of people in the Soviet Union who felt very stifled. They took a vote at the time the Soviet Union was being dissolved, and the people voted overwhelmingly to keep the Soviet Union. But there was a layer of people in the Soviet Union who felt stifled. Doctors, your college professors, your filmmakers, a lot of them did feel stifled by the system. I've heard a story that people have told of doctors in the Soviet Union got paid way more than everybody else because they had to go to medical school and such, but they couldn't do anything with their money. They weren't allowed to buy a new house. They certainly couldn't invest it and start a business. And so I've heard stories of doctors burning their money for entertainment because they had more money than everybody else, but they couldn't do anything with it. And you talked about, you had people that were very, very skilled, and they had maybe a new innovation in how that a state-run industry could operate and be more efficient. But because of the way the bureaucracy had developed, their idea wouldn't be taken seriously, and inefficient things were left intact. And that a lot of people that are creative, and a lot of people that are, that were innovative people, the kind of people that maybe in the Western society would have been in this middle class, felt stifled by the Soviet system. And it was those people that ultimately marched in the streets to support Boris Yeltsin and support the color revolutions and bring down the Soviet Union. It was that layer of kind of educated people who felt trapped by the Soviet system or trapped by the old, really existing socialism. They were kind of the basis of the counter-revolution. However, China remains intact because they changed the way the government, the socialist government, relates to such people. China, starting with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, they started kind of the opposite policy of having the state invest in those innovative people. And Huawei Technologies, the private company that exists, but it was set up because there were some smart, innovative people that the Chinese government found, and they gave them funding, and they connected them with the Chinese military, and they said, all right, go out and start a company with your idea, but do it as part of our overall plan. And now Huawei Technologies is the largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. And that there are many examples of this at 21st century socialism, whether it's in China, if you look at what they're doing in Nicaragua, with their micro-entrepreneurship program, this middle class, that their pessimism was the basis of anti-communism, that they were the people that were involved in kind of overthrowing the socialist governments in 1989, those folks tend to actually be the lifeblood of 21st century socialism. It's those micro-entrepreneurs that are the biggest supporters of Nicaragua and the Sandinista government. And in China, it's those people that the Chinese government has invested in them and enabled them to start their business as part of the state-run plan. They're the ones that are the biggest supporters of. We talk about good polemics and bad polemics. It's funny, I work with libertarians now. Angela McCurdle of the Libertarian Party is a friend, and I never thought I would work with libertarians because I can't stand libertarians a lot of ways. Whenever we start talking about economics, they don't know what they're talking about. But, at one point I was ridiculing libertarians a few years ago. I was ridiculing libertarians for the fact that a lot of libertarians, they like China and they like Russia. And I pointed out, well, guys, you say the government couldn't run the economy. Russia's economy is centered around state-run oil and gas. China has 5-year economic plans and state-run industries. How can you say that? And I got an honest response from a libertarian. And they pointed out, that's true, what you said. China has a heavily state-run economy. Russia's economy is centered around state-run oil and gas. But, and this was their point, to be a small business owner in Russia or to be a small business owner in China is way better than being a small business owner in America. And that's true. The way the laws are written in America, it's to crush the small business owner because they want an absolute monopoly. Whereas in Russia and in China, the state controls the major centers of economic power, but then it injects credit and actively cultivates a middle class. So this question, this petty bourgeois fatalism that is the basis of George Orwell and all of that, it's really kind of outdated. It's an outdated point. George Orwell and all of that, he's dealing with an issue that's not resolved. When I go to Russia, and Noah's been to these conferences, others have been, when I'm in Russia, what I hear is the Russian government saying we need innovators, we need thinkers, and we want to use state revenue to build up. We need young people to invest. And in Nicaragua, they have a slogan, grow where you are planted, because they don't want the population to be concentrated in the cities. So they go out of their way to subsidize people to start farms and enterprises in areas that are not in the capital city or in big cities in order to spread economic growth and development throughout the regions. And that the anti-imperialist world seems to have resolved this issue of this aggravated, stifled middle class. That's no longer the issue in 21st century socialism. So in a way, George Orwell is talking about an out-of-date conversation, right? And if you go to China, you go to Russia, you go to the BRICS countries, they are not suppressing the creative and individual thinkers. They're investing in it. It's over here that the individual thinkers are being suppressed. It's over here that small businesses are being crushed. Since the pandemic, what was the pandemic? The pandemic was the big monopolies using the lockdowns to beat out their competitors and centralize their control, right? It was the small business owners that boarded up their shops and closed down during the pandemic, and the big monopolies secured their grip. So it's kind of an outdated thing. But it's funny, when Noah was talking about Boxer the Horse, I have written a lot about this British Trotskyist called Jerry Healy.
Young marchers, we say the following: you are our most treasured comrades, By your march, you have roused decisive sections of the working class to action. You have dealt a mighty blow to the bans and prescriptions in the Tory government. You will occupy a place of honour for all time in our great movement. We will leave no stone unturned in preparing you for the all-important task in the participation and the strengthening of the leadership of the Socialist Labour League. You are our comrades for all time in this great fight.
Jerry Healey was a leader of the British Trotskyist movement who was a big supporter of Gaddafi in Libya. And the actress Vanessa Redgrave worked with him. He was a big supporter of the Palestinians. And when she won her Academy Award, she gave an anti-Israel speech from the floor of the Academy. And I've been for years, because I admire Gaddafi and what he achieved, I've studied Jerry Healey. And during the 2024 presidential elections, the Democratic Socialists of America, one of their intellectuals, Aidan Beatty, who writes for Jacobin, published a smear piece against Jerry Healey. Jerry Healey, this British Trotskyist anti-Israel activist, has been dead for 35 years, but in the middle of the 2024 elections, they published a hit piece, a smear piece against Jerry Healey. And that book is full of lies, very well debunked. World Socialist website did a pretty good job debunking it. What was the name of the book? What was the name of this smear piece against Jerry Healey? The Party is Always Right. Now, that's technically a quote from Trotsky, but anyone who looked at it, that was an allusion to Napoleon is always right, Boxer the horse. And that's what I pointed out in my pamphlet about it. But Jerry Healey was a British Trotskyist who built a very effective anti-Israel, pro-working class movement of trying to organize the British working people against Zionism and in solidarity with Gaddafi's Libya, in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance, was very, very effective in doing so.
It wasn't just Zionist forces alone that did this job. They had the assistance of Italian radar. They had the assistance of Moroccan radar. And they had the assistance of the American installations inside Tunis of a radar nature. Therefore, it was an international imperialist assassination. That's the first thing we must understand. The second is why, on this occasion, our brother was so guarded so lightly. 2 guards and an old man, an old gardener, in a situation in which the most tremendous mass movement of social revolutionary character is looked upon as that. All the masses are involved. And when all the masses are involved, the Palestinian masses are involved, it's a social revolution. And history teaches us this, that when times when you're leading a socialist revolution, that the imperialist world will seek out your death. And if Lenin had to go into hiding 3 months between July and October in the Soviet Union, before the October 1917 revolution, it was because, and other leaders of the Bolshevik Party had to go into hiding, it was because the enemy always strikes at the leadership. He always hits out at the leadership. Therefore we must say that what is going on in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is a social revolution, not just an armed confrontation with naked fists and stones and everything else. And the Zionists know that. That is why they had to kill Abu.
And towards the end of his life, Jerry Healey started giving lectures about dialectical materialism. And in these lectures, Jerry Healey, they said he was mapping out how he was thinking of things. And people found that to be very esoteric and confusing. But when I look over that material, I'm forced to say, I've heard many times that a great thinker or a great leader doesn't tell you what to think and doesn't teach you what to think. They teach you how to think. It's the method that they're teaching. What Jerry Healy was doing by mapping out his thoughts was he was trying to get the people in his movement to develop ideas the way he developed ideas and to think in the way that he thought, right? He was teaching them how to think, how to process and develop things. And that's one thing in Center for Political Innovation that we've been doing. We've been developing our methods. Now, in Freudian psychoanalysis, there's what they call primary narcissism or infantile omnipotence. When you're a baby, you think you're the most powerful thing in the world. A baby it just cries and it gets fed, right? There's no need for a baby to do anything. So a baby feels like it's all powerful, infantile omnipotence. And then, at some point, as the baby starts walking or whatever, it starts to realize, oh, I'm not the most powerful thing in the world. And the parent or the authority or society shows them how not powerful they are, and the infantile omnipotence is kind of crushed. Then, as the baby grows up and gets older, it gets a more realistic sense of its actual strength and actual abilities. And that process, that's what all of us are doing as we go through life, is figuring out what we're capable of doing, what our limits are. That's called ego development. It's where you're testing your power. And one thing that I think is a real strength of our organization, the Center for Political Innovation, is that we are constantly on a journey of organizational ego development. We're constantly testing our power, right? We're not a huge group, but we're constantly saying, what can we do to change the political discourse? How can we interact with the world around us in order to advance anti-imperialism and change the conversation? And we've been getting better at it through the process of our existence because we're constantly challenging ourselves and testing our power. During the 2024 elections, Donald Trump was claiming he wanted to have peace. Obviously, at this point, it's pretty clear he was lying, but regardless, his campaign had a big peace element to it. So what did we do is we made a big banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands, and we intervened in the Trump campaign to boost that peace message. And the payoff is astronomical because a big chunk of Trump's base are not going along with him in these wars. So by strategically injecting and boosting the peace message, we undermined Trump's ability to rally his base to support the war. That was an effective intervention that we did. And we're not a huge group, but we could get a banner, and we were able to unfurl that banner. We were able to mobilize our members to come do it. That's something we could do. When my book on Kamala Harris was banned from Amazon, that created a big splash, so we raised money and we distributed it in bulk at the Democratic National Convention. The USA was bombing Yemen. We published a book, Who Are the Houthis? What are they fighting for? We distributed it as a way to educate people about the Houthis. And if you look at the history of the Center for Political Innovation, we're not a huge group, but we're constantly testing our power. And today, that was a great example. Noah had the idea of, hey, there's a George Orwell movie, and we need to do something to celebrate Victory Day and the victory over fascism. Why don't we have a demonstration against the George Orwell movie? And look how effective it was. 2 people that we didn't even know, weren't even part of our group, showed up and came to the meeting. And we were out there on the street. We had great conversations with people. And I have a feeling that the video of this rally is going to be used pretty widely because we're going to be sparking a conversation, right? We're testing our power. Now, when we talk about a revolution, generally the way revolutions happen, and this is, I talk about the years of lead, and I talk about counterinsurgency literature, that if you read what Mao Zedong wrote about People's War and the revolutionary method, and if you also read what was written by Frank Kitson, the counterinsurgency expert of British intelligence, basically the way that they understand things is that every society in history is in one of 3 places. When the revolutionary movement is isolated, and it's just groups of people that have dissident ideas, but they don't really have a following, they don't really have a base, that's what Mao Zedong calls strategic defensive, and that's what Frank Kitson calls subversion. And that's where we're at right now. We're in a period of strategic defensive or subversion, right? Frank Kitson would call us subversives, right? We're here having conversations about undermining the system. We're a bunch of subversives. We don't have a base among the population yet. We're just kind of in the strategic defensive or subversion. But then Frank Kitson and Mao Zedong say there's another stage that develops. And that stage is when the divisions in society become intense enough and when the conditions of society have deteriorated enough that the divisions among the ruling elite create an opening and the masses of people are suffering so much that they are open to hearing the message that you enter a period that Mao Zedong called strategic equilibrium. And that's when the revolutionary movement has a base among the population, and there are factions within the ruling class that are kind of aligned with the revolutionary movement, and that's when a revolutionary movement can flourish, is in this period called strategic equilibrium. Frank Kitson called this, you gotta love this, terrorism. He called it terrorism because that's the period when the subversives are able to have an impact. They're able to change things. Terrorism. And in American history, I think there's only one time you could say we were in strategic equilibrium, and that was the late 1930s. During the late 1930s, the Communist Party was big enough, and Roosevelt was the president facing the danger of a fascist threat, that the communists were able to organize mass labor unions, and they were able to force their will on society by having sit-down strikes and forcing the CIO to be recognized as a union all over the country, and passing Social Security. And the communists had enough of a base among the population because the ruling class was divided, because the conditions of the Great Depression were so intense. That was what you could call strategic equilibrium. It was a moment where a revolutionary movement is able to grow and flourish among the population because of the breakdown of capitalism. And then Frank Kitson calls the next stage civil war. Mao Zedong calls it strategic offensive. That's when a question divides society so thoroughly and the revolutionary forces make up the majority on one side of the question that they can then struggle for power. And in the Russian Revolution, the question was World War I. The population didn't want to fight on World War I. Even many of the rich people wanted to trade with Germany. It was their ally. But the Russian government, even after toppling the Tsar, was aligned with the British and the Americans. They wanted to continue fighting World War I. And when it came to the anti-war question, the Bolsheviks that had a huge mass base among the population and lots of people supporting them were the anti-war guys. They were the big anti-war force, and they were able to force their way into power as the force that would bring an end to Russia's involvement in World War I. And in most places, the question has been the question of fascism, right? The way that communist governments came to power generally was when World War II was happening, the communists would build up the biggest force to repel the fascist or Japanese invaders, and then they were able to use the mobilization to propel their way into power. Society is divided, the Japanese invaders are here, and the communists make up the biggest force on one side. That's strategic offensive. And that's generally how revolutionary movements operate. And this is what the counterinsurgency experts say, and this is what and Frank Kitson calls that final stage, that strategic offensive, he calls that civil war. And it basically describes civil war as being when the state itself fractures, with some supporting the radicals and some supporting the old order, right? And so this is counterinsurgency. This is the imperialists talk about this, and this is, you read the revolutionary writings, they're all describing all of this. And we're in a period of strategic defensive, or what Frank Kitson would call subversion. And the ruling class right now is waging a counterinsurgency because they know that divisions among the ruling elite are intensifying, the population and living standard is going down, and they're very afraid that as these divisions intensify and as these conditions get worse, the door to strategic equilibrium could swing open. And so right now they're waging a counterinsurgency. And the counterinsurgency that they're waging is largely a matter of manipulating dissidents. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind. They're waging all kinds of operations right now because what they don't want is a light switch effect where you're with the opposition or you're with the system. They want it, you're with the system or you're in this confusing place where no one knows anything, so the system just kind of wins by default. That's what they're doing, and it's very similar to the years of lead in Italy. In the 1970s in Italy, the population wanted to leave NATO. The NATO alliance was not good for the Italian people, the economy was getting worse, and the Communist Party was very popular, and the Christian Democratic Party was very popular, there were other leftist groups that were very popular, there were Italian nationalist groups that were very popular. The Italian public overwhelmingly wanted to leave the NATO alliance. And so the CIA launched Operation Gladio. And they funded the Italian far-right fascist groups to start killing communists. And then they funded the Red Brigades, which were an extremist Maoist faction, to start killing far-right people and then eventually start killing communists as well. And by the late 70s in Italy, there were so many bombings and so many assassinations, and something like 400 people were killed in the political violence, but a lot more people were just injured. They would shoot people in their kneecaps, kind of like the mafia tradition of kneecapping. People were crippled for life. And the population got so weary of the violence, they didn't want to get involved in politics because you might get shot. And also, people couldn't tell who was really on what side because some communists were killing other communists, fascists were killing other fascists. No one knew who was on what side, and so the status quo won by default. And now Italy is still in NATO. And that's what they're doing right now, is they are waging a counterinsurgency, a years of lead strategy to keep the population that is angry about the fact that our civil liberties are being taken away, angry about the fact that our living standards are going down, angry about the fact that we vote to end the wars. Every candidate says no more wars, and we just get more and more of these wars. People are angry about all the same stuff. And so the idea is to keep us fractured, to keep the opposition fractured and confused, and nobody knows who's on what side, and so maybe the status quo isn't popular, but it just kind of wins by default. That's what they're trying to do right now. And an example of how they did that was after the killing of Charlie Kirk. You know, I mean, we're not huge fans of Charlie Kirk. He would probably disagree with everything we've said so far tonight. But after Charlie Kirk was killed, a big section of the internet, everyone who was at all left, got the memo. It is your job to celebrate the killing of Charlie Kirk. Say, oh yeah, he deserved to die. And it was almost like if you were a left-wing person and you didn't celebrate the killing of this man who, despite whatever his political views was a father, you know, if you didn't celebrate it, you were a bad person. Meanwhile, all the conservative spaces, which at this point are a big part of dissident spaces, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker, they were all saturated with images of leftists celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk. And oh yeah, and of course that's sending the message to them, these people want to kill you. So are you ever going to align with these people to stop a war? No, they want to murder you. And it was a manipulative and brilliant operation. Another thing was Luigi Mangione. The healthcare issue is really important. It really is. I mean, it's a big thing. I mean, that's Bernie Sanders, one of his main talking points was the healthcare thing. The healthcare situation in America is a disgrace. And there was a mass movement, an attempt at one, called the Medicare for All marches that was organized. People remember this, where after the 2016 elections, Jimmy Dore and all kinds of people said we need to have Medicare for All marches. And the mainstream voices dominating leftist space, they treated the Medicare for All marches like they were completely unacceptable. They were fascist, they were white supremacist, how dare they talk about, you know, they had, you know, there was one former Nazi who was going to speak at a rally in Kentucky, and there was whole long articles about, oh, this former Nazi, and he didn't even end up speaking at the rally, but they made a whole thing. How dare you march peacefully for Medicare for All? And we participated in the Medicare for All marches. It was a great thing that we did at CPI, but you know, there was a huge campaign against it. But then, you know, fast forward to Luigi Mangione, one guy, allegedly, I'm not sure he's guilty of the crime, went and allegedly killed a healthcare CEO. And the very same voices that were not okay with a mass peaceful protest for healthcare, that called it Nazi and fascist and how dare Jimmy Dore and all of this, all of a sudden this guy murdering somebody on the streets of Manhattan, that got praised. And to the point that NPR was running stories about how now United Healthcare, oh, they're approving people's claims. Look, the murder worked. And the mainstream media was just celebrating this murder. You had mainstream media voices everywhere, and everything was done to turn Luigi Mangione into a superstar, to say that we need more political violence. Why is lone wolf assassination okay, but a mass movement is not okay? Well, it's because of the years of lead. A lone wolf assassination is an act that will lead to further polarization and confusion and fear among the public, whereas a mass movement is a thing that brings people together and gets people of different political backgrounds to come together and to learn. You know, part of the reason that the George Orwell stuff appeals is because those of us who are here tonight, we know that a lot of people just don't think. A lot of people want to take the path of least resistance, and they don't want to think. And what we're doing is we are challenging people and doing everything we can to get people to think. And that's what we were out there doing today. We were out there with signs about Orwell, denouncing George Orwell, handing out leaflets, and trying to get people to think. And a lot of people don't want to think. A lot of people have been trained not to think. And our job is to go around awakening people. They say we're brainwashing people, we're a cult. No, we're waking people up. People are already brainwashed. People are asleep. We're trying to wake them up and get them to think. That's what we're doing. And it's not an easy thing to do, but we're trying to awaken people to think because people will do anything they can to avoid thinking. And we are trying to get people to think. And violence and killing is not something that gets people to think. But joining a mass movement, having comrades and friends, organizing, that's a thing where people learn in the process and change what they think. So much of social media is just pandering to what people already believe, just reinforcing, oh, if you're mad about this, well, this video is really mad about it. But they don't teach you anything. I say no preaching without teaching. If you're not teaching anybody anything, you're not doing any good. But I also say no teaching without preaching. We've all been there in the class where the teacher doesn't give a shit and is just kind of reading a script, and there's no passion or truth behind it, and we all get bored, right? If you're teaching mathematics, you should be fired up and preaching about mathematics, right? And if you're preaching about healthcare, you should educate your audience and teach them in the process. No preaching without teaching, no teaching without preaching. That's the rule. We must challenge people to think, and we must awaken them with passion. You know, I can tell a couple stories now. One story I'll never forget is I remember I was in my college dorm, and this must have been around 2008, 2009, and I heard like knocking going down on the door, right? There was a guy knocking on every door in my college dorm. And I guess other people weren't around. It was a Saturday night. I went to like what they call a suitcase college where everyone goes home for the weekends, but I wasn't home for the weekends, and so he's knocking on every door. So finally he gets to my door, boom, boom, boom. I open the door. The guy says, "You got any drugs?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I just got out of the fucking army, man. I want to get stoned. You got any drugs? Got any drugs?" And I said to him, I can't use drugs. I'm a communist. And he's like, "A communist? And you can't use drugs if you're a communist?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Are you like North Korea?" I said, kind of. And I remember the guy sat on my dorm room bed, and he talked to me about having served in Iraq and his military experience. And I think about, what was that guy trying to do? He found a college campus, and he was going through the dorms, knocking on every door. "You got any drugs? Got any drugs?" Because he didn't want to think. Because he'd seen horrible, horrible things in Iraq, and he was trying to make those thoughts go away. He was trying to avoid thinking. But then when he sat on my couch, and we talked about communism for an hour and a half, and we talked about his experiences in Iraq, I was helping him to think, but to see things in a different way. And that is kind of what it means to be a revolutionary. And sometimes I think we overemphasize the dramatic stuff. That's what's another problem with this social media culture. People want to be theatrical and all that. And sometimes just sitting down and having one-on-one conversations with people is the most important thing, engaging with people. And a woman that they would have them meet. This was during the 1960s. And this woman was the leader of the Roman Catholic Association in China, right? It was Roman Catholics that were loyal to the Chinese government. And she would tell the story of when Mao came to power in the 1940s, 1949. She continued going to church, and that she didn't support it. Yet she saw China start changing. Before the Chinese Revolution, there were children who never saw the sun. Never saw the sun because they worked in mines, and they would have to go down in the mines before the sun came up, and they wouldn't be able to come up until the sun had already gone down. And they worked in those mines. They talk about the life, the extreme poverty that existed before the Chinese Revolution of 1949. If you look at what China is today now, with 800 million people lifted out of poverty and the second largest economy in the world, you cannot underestimate what the Chinese Revolution achieved. That's why this George Orwell stuff is so ridiculous. The idea you just get back to square one. China's not where they were before, I'll tell you that much. But, they never saw the sun before the revolution. Shanghai was the world capital of child prostitution. And they used to say, well, the Chinese are just ruthless, evil people because they sell their children into prostitution. Well, what that was there was so much malnutrition. And when people were starving to death, they would sell their child to a brothel in Shanghai because they would be able to eat if they did that. That was the horrendous poverty that people were facing. Edgar Snow talks about that in his very important book, Red Star Over China. And this woman that the revolutionaries would meet with from the Catholic Association, she would say, I was not supporting the communists. I didn't work against them, but I just went to my Catholic church and I would pray. And then things started changing in China. And suddenly we had our first power plants. And suddenly we had land redistributed to the peasants. And suddenly we had access to education. And I realized that all the things that I was praying for were coming true, and that maybe God can work through people, and that we shouldn't just be waiting for an angel to come from heaven. We can join a revolutionary movement and enact God's will on earth by fighting against imperialism. And she would share that, and that spoke to a lot of people. So I guess I just want to end by saying, let no one tell you that you are powerless. Never succumb to the allure of pessimism. We've got to organize a mass movement. We've got to connect with people. We've got to do the hard work, and it's not easy, but it's important. And sometimes the work that is not the most front page news exciting is the most important work. And that a lot of what we are doing is building connections with people, teaching people, helping people, and learning from people. That from the masses to the masses, The masses are the water, the revolutionary is the fish. We're learning from the people, we're engaging with the people, and we're offering them a way forward. And I am very confident about all that we're going to achieve. Some very, very exciting things are coming up for CPI. And I guess I'll just touch on this. So what we're doing with CPI right now is that, for the next couple months, we are doing a book blast. Because right now, organizationally, we have big plans for July and August. In July, we're doing a workshop in Los Angeles, we're doing a workshop in Minneapolis, we're going to have another event here on July 2nd. And then in August, we're having our national 7-day training program in Chicago, which is going to be very exciting. We're going to bring people from all around the country to attend, but in order to do that, we need to raise funds. And so we're going to be pushing our books very, very hard. That's part of why NOAA has launched the Juche Reading Group, is to start getting this out there. I've got another book coming up, and we're doing outreach with the flower campaigns. We're going to spend May and June fundraising, largely by getting our literature out there, fundraising, pushing our books very, very hard so that in July and August we can have 2 strong months of workshops and then our national convention in Chicago. That'll be during the 7-day program. On August 15th, we'll be having our national convention. And this reminds us of how important it is that we engage with people, how important it is that we talk to people. And we're going to take these 2 months because we're raising funds by getting our books out there, right? With print on demand, you don't have to pay anything when you write the book. You only pay for it when you print it, right? So when people buy one of our books, that's money that goes into funding our operations. We're going to take this 2 months, May and June, to push our books very, very hard so that we can have a strong July and we can have a strong August and we can continue doing what it is that we're doing, which is awakening people to think and building a community that empowers people and awakens them to know their true power and think and engage and learn the method of taking the world around them and struggling to make it better. So dare to struggle, dare to win. Thank you, everybody.
Designed large systems to handle loans, $72 billion portfolio, and credit derivatives to hedge the market. During 2008, I was a first responder dealing with the crash. It scared the shit out of me. I had for years just had so much confidence in the system, like there's FDIC insurance, so there's a lot. I was led to believe, the system can't crumble. Bank failures happen outside of America. It's like Latin American countries, not here. 2008 was a huge wake-up call for me. I could never look at the system the same again after that because I kind of know where everything's buried. Post 2008, I'm in the Swiss bank, and we had to do new regulations were coming down the pipe, Dodd-Frank, because the credit derivatives were like a sword of Damocles hanging over the market. It was dangerous. It's always systemic risk. The danger was in 2008. They went through a relentless printing press. And they circulated so many dollars, but it wasn't but they didn't distribute it through just regular folk. It was just dispensed through, the 1%. And here I am. I'm running the systems. They're asking me to check, the risk against Lehman Brothers. I would run these queries on Oracle systems to go through and scour like what's going to be the next bank failure. So it was the only time I actually had a corner office. I was just normally a lowly IT guy that they would just bring over when they needed a report. But when shit hit the fan, they called me up and said, tell us where our risk was. And I used to write historical queries to look at trends and what would fail next. I never developed the same confidence again. Everyone celebrated when the financial crisis was over. I just felt like we're just kicking the can. We're just kicking this can down the road for our kids. And lo and behold, we got $38 trillion in deficit. And what are they doing right now to us? AI this, AI that. Like, who the fuck asked for AI? I'm sorry to curse. I didn't ask for AI. I respect technology. I know I'm a programmer. I know that you take some junior devs, you give them some training, and they could do wonderful things. People can do amazing shit with technology. You don't need this AI. AI is just, you know what AI is? It's a myth right now. I'm not against using AI to benefit people, but right now, they're just jamming it down our throats. Why? Because they're trying to make it like money. It's fake money. They're calling it tokens. The dollars, they know they can't resuscitate the dollar. They can't do the 2008 printing press again. So what are they going to do? They need to justify the commerce in dollars. And they think AI is the last great thing to put in the system. Like they think of it as an investment, but it's all bullshit. It's just to make it's what they're trying to say. The U.S. dollar is backed by AI, so therefore you should trust AI. That's why they're making it out to be. You hear about it. They talk about it like it's a god. You hear like how dare they, like subvert religion, and put this thing on a pedestal to make you feel like nothing. And I think that's where we have to resist. There's this like, we're constantly being barraged with like these messages that, oh yeah, this thing will take over your job and you don't provide much value. And I hate that message. I want to shut that message off.
And they told us all to learn to code so we wouldn't lose our jobs, and now AI codes for us.
Right. And it's all bullshit. I could tell you, I could show you how it works. It's just templates controlled by voice query, But you show it to a boomer, and it's Netscape all over again. They think it's like the greatest thing, It's a hype. We're in a hype cycle. The one difference I'll say about the .com, I don't agree about the .com bubble. I do think the .com bubble, while it was frothy, while it was bad, it at least did one thing right. They invested in the fiber optic backbone, and that's why we have very high, fast speed internet. This AI bubble, it's doing nothing of the sort. It's not creating excess capacity for us. It's doing nothing. All it is devaluing. It's a way of devaluing labor. So, yeah, I mean, that's just what I want to get off my chest. It's been bothering me. I don't want to be a Luddite. I hope, I believe in growth. I believe that everybody wants to work. I think everybody wants to produce according to their own terms. And if we allow that to happen, I do believe people could do amazing stuff. And that's all I got to say. I'm really happy to meet with like-minded folk, and it's good to know I'm not alone. And thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Charles.
Oh, sorry.
There was something I was thinking about for a while. We were talking about AI, and then Caleb, you brought up something about degrowth. And then it brought me back to AI, but not only just AI, it brought me, there was a podcast I was watching, not gonna say who it was. Let's just say it's a very respectable conversation, and it was about immigration and economy. And one of the commentators said, we can't have higher wages because there's too many immigrants in here. I'm like, I don't know if that's how it could work. And also, if we want an economy of growth, would it more be better, per se? And I go back to AI, because especially me as an artist and a voice actor, and it's been a big fight in the community. And I thought about it because I remember during our meeting, I think it was last Saturday, I believe, you brought up AI voices for books through ACX. And I said, ooh, I don't want to go there because I know ACX is part of Amazon. Yeah. And so is Audible. And they're notorious about using AI voices to take away opportunities for all artists and to make things cheaper in general. And especially, it's not just that, it's using your likeness without you knowing to say and do things you didn't say or do, especially propaganda. Prime example, I know it was in TikTok. There's a lady who was very well known who used her voice for a voicemail, and they took her voice for AI, and she said, I did not do that. I have never once ever did that. And how dare you take my voice without me knowing, my likeness without me knowing? And I was just like, and then I didn't want that to happen to me, but I thought about growth and degrowth. And it's not necessarily, it's like, oh, I hate AI. It's like, I hate what it's being used for in this economic system of capitalism. Because if it was just, oh, blank statement, AI is bad, I'm like, I don't see that being the case in China. I don't see it at all. I'm like, it's how it's being used here. And it's not just taking away opportunities and jobs for everyone. It's how it's being used for your likeness, to surveil you, and just to take things away from you. And I'm like, and I kept on thinking, we need to change this economic system so that it's not being used, AI is not being used to take away jobs from people or to surveil people, but to assist and to grow our standards of living and our economy. So that it's not like, oh my God, immigrants are taking away everything, taking away jobs from us. I'm like, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but instead, that should be an advantage, not a disadvantage for degrowth, for lower wages, or we can't take these jobs, but instead and I was just like, why is it that libertarians always feel this way about immigrants are the reason why we have lower wages and no jobs? I'm like, that doesn't add up, because especially in China, once again, they have a bigger population than we do, higher standards of living. I'm like, something ain't mathing here. So instead, I was just like, and I think we need to use this as a time to educate about growth and coming together and using stuff like AI to be better for growth. That's all I have to say for that.
CPI for this event, this very important event. I'm going to go over a little bit of the background that Noah talked about, and the fact that it impacts us today, that what Orwell was doing and the role of the Anglo-Zionists that have hijacked the government impacts today and our domestic and foreign policy. And that's something that is our greatest challenge as an organization, especially when we're dealing with a large anti-war movement that needs to be mobilized. I'll just read this off, that George Orwell's Animal Farm is at best a simple allegorical interpretation of Stalin's Soviet Union. But it's closer to propaganda that ignores the historical basis of the Bolshevik Revolution and demeans the historic victory the Soviet Union had achieved over fascism and German imperialism during World War II. And essentially the novel itself was in the context of preserving the British Empire. That was the intent. Now we know that Great Britain was an ally with the USSR in the war against the fascist Axis powers. But when examining the context of Great Britain, they did very little of the fighting relative to what the USSR had fought in the Eastern Front. USSR had destroyed 80% of the Axis armies at the end of the war. And what the British was doing essentially was what's called peripheral nipping. They were basically focusing on the Middle East because that's where the oil was. But essentially, Stalin had demanded that in order to relieve the pressures once the Nazi Germany had invaded the USSR, Stalin demanded a second front to relieve the pressures from the onslaught in the Eastern Front. But instead, the Anglo-American forces carried out peripheral nipping to secure the oil resources instead. And when the second front finally did come about on June 6, 1944, the war was already reversed. The Soviet Union had achieved victory, but at a bloody cost. They've lost approximately 27 million people during that war, far in excess to what the United States or England had suffered. It was the USSR that destroyed the Nazi war machine. And that's what's been covered up by the mass media. That's what's covered up with George Orwell, to deny the success and the achievements of the Soviet Union. That's part of the cover-up that we ourselves have to address, because that element is at play even today in our government. Now, it should be pointed out that during this period of time, prior to World War II, I should say, that the Soviet Union was always interested in fighting fascism even before World War II was formally commenced. They were the ones that wanted to build an alliance even with the imperial powers of the West to stop the Nazi Germany, but they refused to do so. If you look at the Spanish Civil War, for example, it was the Soviet Union that provided the aid to the Spanish Republic and no one else, even though supposedly the United States and England and France was fight World War II against fascism. But the reality is they did not fight fascism.
The U.S. signed laws making it illegal to go and fight with the Spanish Republic.
That's right, and that's what people don't know about, the fact that the Soviets were the ones from the very beginning were in the forefront of fighting fascism. And then even Neville Chamberlain, when he signed his so-called appeasement deal with Germany, the intent of that was to push Germany towards Russia and not fight and not confront Nazi Germany. And that's something that the historians, the mainstream historians totally deny and totally forget and deliberately distort what had happened. So those are the examples of what the British Empire were trying to do at the time. But of course we know the British Empire was totally hypocritical in its so-called Orwellian analysis. The fact that the British imperialists were the biggest oppressors of the third world, in the developing world. I mean, most people realize this, they're an empire that never slept. And it was the British Empire that always functioned with the idea that they needed to dominate not only the developing world, but continental Europe. That was always their objective that we see to this day. The example, of course, in the European theater, whenever France was the dominant European continental power, the British would unite with its allies against France. When it was Russia during the 1850s, was viewed as the dominant power. Again, it was Britain that turned their allies, getting their allies to target Russia, Tsarist Russia. And then when Germany emerged as the dominant power in Europe, it was Germany's turn to be targeted by England. So it's a pattern that has always existed. And I think that's something that is ignored, and to this day is something that the British Empire has always looked at as their objective to maintain their power. And this is where the role of the United States plays a role, where after the American Civil War, when the British was on the side of the Confederacy, they realized that we shouldn't be on the wrong side of history. And of course, you may well know that the Union was backed by Tsarist Russia. Mm-hmm. And again, the British said, look, we need to change this relationship. We want to preserve our empire. So what do? We want to build an alliance with the United States. And this is that relationship, that transformation that has occurred to this day. The fact that the British Empire has hijacked our government for their own ends. So that shows, the fundamental British hypocrisy. The fact that there's a government that is an aristocracy that's driving these policies. Of course, we know that the British Round Table, we know as the British Round Table, which is, I guess, their version of the deep state that is driving the policies. And the British Empire is guilty of racist slavery, economic slavery. They expanded that economy. They induced famine in Ireland. They destroyed the Indian economy to monopolize the textile industry, for example. India had a major textile economy that was destroyed by the British Empire. And of course, they pushed opium as a means of trade to address the balance of payment crisis with China. and in order to preserve their empire and preserve their silver holdings. So these are the things that they've done, which of course George Orwell and its empire totally ignore. So what was going to give a little bit of background, what was the driving force behind George Orwell's plan to attack the Soviet Union? As I talked about the fact that the British Empire basically did not carry out the Second Front until the end of World War II with D-Day, they had a systematic plan to try to hijack the American government. And of course, George Orwell and his propaganda was part of that process. It began, people think that it began with the death of FDR. And of course, Stalin himself felt that FDR may have been poisoned by the Churchill gang. And it was Stalin who sent a young Kosygin to try to view FDR's body for arsenic poison. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the person that denied that opportunity, unfortunately. So we don't know whether or not, based on his observation, I don't think there was an autopsy done on FDR, but his death was felt as necessary by the British Empire to reverse FDR's plan to implement the Atlantic Charter, which was I guess, a compromise where he was willing to get the United States. FDR was getting, I'm sorry, let me get back. It was FDR's way of trying to address the colonial question and at the same time intervene on the side of the Allies during World War II. And Churchill went along with it in order to get the United States involved in the fighting like they did in World War I. But he was against, of course, anything that would undermine the British Empire. So he had to get FDR killed as part of the process. Also at the same time, Churchill wanted to launch an invasion of the USSR after Germany surrendered. That would commence on July 1st of 1945. And it was an operation called Unthinkable. I don't know if anyone has heard about this, but this was a plan to get the Western Allied powers, along with captured German forces, to launch an invasion of the USSR. And of course, it didn't happen because I think the American, first of all, there were like 250 Soviet divisions versus 85 in the West. So it would have been very difficult to launch this campaign. But I think the American people were against it. There was a movement to bring the troops home movement in that period of time, and it never really materialized. But that does give you an idea that Churchill was really very much motivated to attack the Soviet Union, even after defeating Nazi Germany, and even they were supposed allies. And of course, we know Churchill was the one that was responsible for invading the young Soviet Union back in 1919 when he organized the White Armies. So from the very beginning, it was virulently anti-communist, despite the rhetoric of being allied with the Soviet Union.
One question. Is it okay to ask a question?
Yeah. Right.
Didn't around this time when Churchill, I found this one thing interesting.
Yeah.
Was when they were rescuing the troops from was it Dunkirk? Churchill made, because at the time France was occupied, and so they made a strategic decision. Churchill did to bomb the French Navy, which was kind of outside of the scope of repelling the Germans.
Yeah, I mean, I think at that time it was something where I think that was a little bit later on, possibly. But
I'm just curious.
yeah, I think that was a time when, of course, France was under control of Germany, and they decided they were considered enemies at the time. But in terms of English behavior during the war, another aspect is that they focused on targeting the civilian population through their bombing campaigns, as opposed to launching a major fight on the second front. I mean, of course, this happened much later with Dresden. That's the most famous example, where they used the major bombing rate to target a civilian population, and over 25,000 civilians were killed. But that was the type of mentality that they had, where they would target civilians as opposed to military targets as a priority, which is kind of like what the United States adopted in terms of mass bombings. They totally destroyed Korea during the Korean War, North Korea. And that was very much Curtis LeMay's adaptation of the British methodology. So So the death of FDR was a consolidation of the control of the British Empire to U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy. And part of that process, of course, is the role of the Zionists in this process, which they played a big role in the United States entering World War I. And they've also played a big role in formulating, developing the role of the deep state and its apparatus, the role of the neocons, the role of Epstein's gang that formulated and controlled our U.S. government and hijacked it, the role of AIPAC, for example. So these are the things that are kind of a backdrop, but kind of linked to what Animal Farm represented. It was an attempt to destroy that relationship that existed between the United States, as was reported out, and the USSR, and to try to transform it to what it is today. And of course, ultimately, we need to make the fundamental changes to overturn that relationship by ending the war, overturning the deep state, and to rebuild America. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay. Okay. I have to say, I laugh when I go online and I see on social media right-wingers saying how communists, they're all taking over the United States. They're the great enemy. And I'm like, wait a minute. The WEF, if you look at their website, they openly say their role is to save capitalism. They don't say socialism, they say capitalism. Not paying attention, I tell people. You know, and they really think that the Democrats are communists, right? Which is like such a joke. Now, I can tell you something. As a private substitute teacher, I know this is all a joke because high school students, they're not being indoctrinated to become communists. That is not happening, okay? These students, first of all, they rarely ever read any novels. They don't read really beyond the 4th grade level because they don't want them to. The system doesn't, okay? But when they do read books, there are 2 types of literature that are basically mandatory throughout the United States. One of them is Jewish Holocaust literature. That is like 100%, I don't care where you are, whether you're in Mississippi or New Jersey, required reading. And the other is anti-communist books. Whether it's Robert Conquest on tyranny, which, by the way, Robert Conquest worked for MI5, and he got his funding for his books from the CIA. Or they may read, quote, anti-communist Holocaust literature like Survival of the Killing Fields. Although Pol Pot, for those of us who know, he was funded and trained by British MI6 and the CIA.
That's right.
Okay? The Cambodian military was not, they didn't have the stomach to do things like cut off arms of children, but the CIA and MI6 taught soldiers in Cambodia how to get beyond this kind of, blockage of doing these horrific acts. Talk about MK Ultra. The point here is that the purpose of these books is obviously to brainwash students, just like 1984 and Animal Farm. What's the message? And the message is there's no point in organizing for a better world because it's not possible. But you know what? That's not true. It is possible. Even in the darkest hours, it is possible. My mother's cousin, he was basically kidnapped off the street in Italy, and he was put into the army. They were forced to march to Stalingrad, and he was able, at the last minute, to, in the snow, he deserted, okay? He was, as a Christian, not going to kill other Christians or people in general. It says in the Bible, thou shalt not kill, and he was not going to do that. And when he came back, he obviously told his family, including my mother, his experiences in the Soviet Union. And one of the things that he said was that the Russians were the most Christian people of Europe, even more than Italians. He said he, as a man who represented the upper class, he had traveled around the world, and he said, I always thought Italians were the most Christians and had the greatest faith, but I have to say, no, the Russians do beat us in this. And he talked about how when he had been in this small village that he deserted to, he asked the people there why they were so adamant about not capitulating to the Nazis. They were willing to starve to death. And what they told him was they preferred to die than to go back to slaving 12 to 16 hours a day for starvation wages. They said, never, ever again. It was a question of giving meaning to their parents and their experience and suffering in this unjust world where they basically were working themselves to death and dying at very young ages, and to give a future for their children. And you know what? They defeated the Nazis. You know why? Because they had faith. Because it is possible to have a better world, and all we need is the faith to believe it.
So I'm really excited to be a part of this organization for so many reasons, mainly in part because this is like a long day coming for me and many of us, looking for a group where everyone is on the same page. We resonate as a community. We're all from different backgrounds, and we're all here to learn from each other. And we're all here to expand our understanding of the wider world, and also how to speak to other people about what it is that we want to do and what we stand for. So that is exciting to me. I haven't been a part of many groups, but the groups I have been a part of, none of real note, just people trying to get together to make something happen. They weren't really serious because a lot of them were just into complaining and talking about a narrative, what if this, what if that, and never being in the moment. And CPI is an in the moment organization. So that's what I love about this. So having said that, my feelings about Animal Farm is that it's kind of a full circle moment. It hasn't held up very well. I believe we are on the farm. We don't know it. Here in America, we are on the farm. And those animals on that farm are living amongst us. They just don't know the roles they play to either get other people off the farm, keep people on the farm. You have a lot of people who feel, why should we leave? Everything is great, everything is good. It reminds me very much of, I wasn't there of course, but during slavery where there were some enslaved people who were like, why are you leaving? This is fabulous. This is, you're leaving. I'm gonna have to go and tell, our enslavers that you plan on running away tonight. And that's the same mentality many people have in this country and around the world. But because America has such a stranglehold on the economy, it ripples out across the world and it affects everybody. So we are in the eye of the storm. And so everyone is looking to see which way the winds will blow and how their lives will be affected by how we as Americans respond to what our government is doing. So it's important for us to be able to speak to what the government is doing, articulated in a way that is not just powerful, but have real, some grit to it, and then put action to the words. Again, CPI is action to the words. And that's what, again, I can go on, it's great, it's great. As far as this book and what Orwell is doing, I just want to speak a little bit about some of the animals on the farm. The way my mind thinks, I can connect dots, and once I can connect them clearly enough, I can then articulate them to others in a way that maybe some people didn't realize. So I'm going to talk more about this, perhaps on my Facebook page, perhaps morning message, because it really resonates. I want to talk about the pig squealer, and he was the head of propaganda. And so that was really powerful to me because in the book where they're eating well. The pigs have hoarded. Now they've hoarded the apples and the milk, and they're eating well. And the other animals are like, why are you eating so well? What's going on? And these pigs who are now running everything say, well, look, we are the people who keep all of this going, and pigs need this stuff for our sustenance. We need to have this. So we have to eat more of this than you. And we keep things going. And in my mind, I heard, we're the job creators. We're the job creators. So we have to have more. We have to hoard wealth. We have to hoard resources. And understand that if we don't retain talent, the whole world will collapse in on itself. So sit down and take your crumbs and stop asking us for more, because more isn't coming. Even though you are producing more, you're still not going to get anything from what you've produced, except the crumbs that we want to give you. And even then we may not, because we're buying your free speech, we're buying the politicians, and they are going to suppress your wages until you burst. And then when you do, we're going to make sure there's a police state to beat you back on the working line. And that's what's going on. So that's what Squealer kind of reminded me of very much. And then Boxer very much reminds me of, well, representing, I would just say, representing that hard-working, the American dream, the apple pie, work hard and keep your head down, and at the end of it, you'll be just like us, which is just a giant fuck you. Because you will never get there. And the sad part about it is the game is set up so that you never get there. So I want to say, like, America is like a runway model. You'll never get there on the runway. You'll never be hot enough or thin enough, but it's an aspirational, right? It's an aspirational
Speak for yourself, Bree. I'll get there one.
Vision. Well, I want to tell you, you're already there, Noah, so. So you'll never get there. So America will keep you in this aspirational mindset. It'll always tell you that you didn't make it because you didn't try hard enough. You got to take another run at it. Not understanding that as you're running, they're pulling the rug out from under you. So you'll never really get there. And then you will literally die trying, or you will die having left nothing to your heirs because now you're too old. And because of our healthcare system, if you do own anything like a home or anything of any real means, all that must be funneled back into the system again. So it's really a dirty piece of work, that America's playing on us. And for those who don't know, and some people know when it's too late, and that's when the anger comes out, and that's what I believe the people who are running this place are beginning to see, that they are beginning to see through our bullshit. And that is making people very angry, and they can't control mobs with that level of anger, and you've lied to us. There are some of us who have seen the lie for many, many years, dare I say centuries, and some of us who never saw them, because the job of the upper classes is to keep you divided and to keep you looking at the people who have no power, as we all know, and say it's because of them that you can't do X, Y, and Z. And we need to understand that's not the way. That's super, super not the way. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the sheep, because the sheep are really, wow, they're an interesting breed. So they're fed propaganda by the ruling class, saying 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and I found that to be really interesting because it sort of reminded me of the low information voters who can't digest a nuanced political conversation. So they've got to throw these little sound bites at them. And that reminded me, the 4 legs good, 2 legs bad reminds me of Yes We Can, right? It reminds me of I'm With Her, Not Me, Us, Make America Great Again, The Shining City on a Hill, They hate us for our freedom. You know, all of these slogans are basically 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And that's really where they want the sheep to keep thinking. And then they use that propaganda as they activate you. So what I feel is though, in many ways, we are all Trojan horses, depending on our mindset, our ideology. So you want a better world, but you're a Trojan horse infected with racism. And you take that into a community that's trying to do something. And your thoughts and everything that you're bringing can either poison that, because there might be like-minded people in that group, and then you activate them. And then that brings your whole group down. So you have to have a mindset that is of the people, not just certain people, or you're gay, or you're trans, or whatever the situation may be, but it just can't be about one group of people. And we can't get to where we want to be by saying, if you let these people in, it's going to bring down what we're trying to achieve, because we all have to get there together. We are going to all get there together, or none of us will get there. And so keeping all of that in mind, walking with that mindset, it really brings to mind a lot of the things that Caleb says about how we have to like dare to struggle and dare to win. Yeah. Be bold, be confident in your stance, be confident about who you are, understand that what you're fighting for is the future, and we're making a difference now, and it is about the energy that we bring forth as a collective that's going to make us a really great organization moving forward. So thank you. Thank you.
I want to just sum up, because a recurring theme that I heard from Briggy, I heard from Noah, I heard from everyone, I heard from Jessica, everyone who spoke, kind of what I was hearing was that what makes Orwell's propaganda so effective is it points to things that we all know about capitalism, things that we all don't like about capitalism, and pins that on communism. Is that kind of a recurring theme? Like Briggy was talking about how all these characters all speak to personalities that we've all dealt with in capitalism, and uses that, right? Like that's kind of what Briggy was getting at. That's what Noah said also, right? We've all met the person who's just a kind of a conformist, and I thought that was important. And then the other thing is what Paul was touching on was the fact that, you know, and this relates to so much of it, but abundance should not be a curse, right? Technological advancement should lead to prosperity for all. Self-driving cars should be a great innovation that leads to wealth, but it's only in our irrational economic system that technological advancement and abundance creates poverty. And that is a foundational principle. That's, when you talk about Marxism, that's what Marx spent pages and pages writing, and he didn't come up with it. Franz Fourier and others came up with it. It was Fourier, or they made that point of abundance being the source of want and poverty. But yet, when we hear so-called socialists speak nowadays, a lot of them think the problem with capitalism is there's too much growth. And that's one of the main arguments I hear. There's a book you can get now, Degrowth, the Vision Beyond Capitalism, and that capitalism is bad because it just makes growth, and growth is bad for the environment, and wanting more. And this is, the idea that growth is bad, that's not Marxism, right? And a lot of conservatives and libertarians think it is. Well, it's not. The idea that growth is bad, that's called Malthusianism, and that's the ideology of the British Empire. And that's the ideology that was the foundation for George Orwell's work, and they were promoting it. And the essence of Malthusianism is viewing human beings as animals, right? And that even though Marx spent his life writing against Malthus, he wrote pages and pages, one of the problems with Marx's work, I would argue, is he still kind of had the idea, he was a modernist coming out of feudalism, that human beings were animals. And Charles Darwin's work, that's one of the main critiques. Darwin was a Malthusian, and as much as he may have had great insights about biology, he still viewed human beings as animals. And Sigmund Freud, I draw a lot from Sigmund Freud, but he also viewed human beings as animals. And human beings are not an animal. And, you know, to touch on what Irving said, right? The notion that human beings are animals, you know, And I hate, this isn't to single out any community, right? Because, there's awful things in the Bible, there's awful things one could interpret, from different religions and all there, but there is one holy book that says all of mankind are animals except for one race, and that's the Talmud, right? Let's be real about that. That's what the Talmud says, and Zionism, as an ideology, says that only one group of people are human and others are animals, and blatantly says so. And it was the British Empire that believes human beings are animals and has this Malthusian worldview that created Israel and used the Zionists, that Theodore Herzl marketed himself to the British and said, send the Jews to Palestine to set up a settler state and we'll be your kind of outpost. And if it wasn't for the British banking elite, in particular the Rothschilds bankrolling him, and a banker here named Jacob Schiff, right, who was also a big supporter of them. The World Zionist Organization would never have taken off. We would never have had the Balfour Declaration. We would never have had Israel to begin with. Israel was a British Empire project to begin with, and it had a British Empire settler ideology of human beings are animals and we're going to be the superior, sophisticated Europeans to kick around the brown people. That was the basis of Israel, and it looks like at this point Israel has its own strength, and Israel is now starting to pull the strings and tell the American government what to do. But Israel is an outgrowth of that Anglo-British Empire, colonizer, imperialist ideology that is based on seeing human beings as an animal and saying, oh, they've been breeding too much, we got to cull the herd, right? That is the foundation of all of this.
Mowing the lawn. Indeed,
and it's the belief that, and I think about Margaret Sanger, who started out as a Marxist, as a socialist here in New York City, was the editor of, I think it was called Rebel Woman, was like a socialist magazine that Margaret Sanger was a very wealthy Irish-American woman here in New York City, was the editor of. And she threatened to kill John D. Rockefeller, and so she had to flee the country because you couldn't threaten to kill a very wealthy person. She moved to Britain to avoid the law, and then she went to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, she was a socialist because she believed in birth control, and she believed in free love, and she believed in free sex. And she got to the Soviet Union, and it wasn't a free love, free sex paradise. It wasn't that. They had the traditional family. They had things she didn't agree with. And she went back to Britain, and John D. Rockefeller was in Britain, where he was the leader of what was called the Neo-Malthusian Society. And I guess they reconciled, and they made a deal, and she gave up her socialism, and John D. Rockefeller brought her back to New York City, where she had fled from, and she set up the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn and set it up. And during the Great Depression, she published a pamphlet talking about the cruelty of charity, and she blamed the Great Depression on charity, that we'd been feeding the poor people too much, and that's why they were breeding, and that's why the Great Depression was happening. The communists were organizing hunger marches and demonstrations, and Margaret Sanger was saying, well, if we just stop feeding them, then we'll stop having a Great Depression. And she said in her Malthusian pamphlet, attacking Marxism, she said, Marxism says the problem is the economic system, the problem is man itself, man's desire to have growth. Anti-growth is the foundation of the British Empire Malthusian worldview. And so when I see Marxists attacking the notion of growth, they just don't understand what they're getting at. The whole point of all the revolutions that have happened in the 20th century was these are countries that the colonizers and the imperialists were keeping from growing. And they had a revolution so they could grow and build. Growth is not bad. Growth is not bad. But I'm excited for our organization. We got a lot of exciting opportunities coming up. This is a strange time to organize. Nothing makes any sense. But in a way, that's good, because that means none of the old tricks are working, right? And that creates opportunities for those of us who take this seriously and want to get things done to go out and do what needs to be done. So I'm optimistic. I'm looking forward to the future, and I think this was a great meeting. I want to thank Noah for having the idea to put this together. And I hope that you all will come to our meeting we're having on July 2nd. That will kick off the workshops and all that we're doing in July. And then I hope you'll join us at our 7-day program that we're doing. I know Paul's already registered. He was one of the first people to register for the 7-day program that we are doing in Chicago in August. And yeah, we're doing great stuff. We're out there organizing, doing outreach. And the point is we want to empower people. We want to awaken people and figure out how we can get human beings to think. So dare to struggle, dare to win. And thank you, everybody.